game.
They did it! They did it! They did it!
And they're going crazy. They're jumping on each other.
One of the most unbelievable finishes you will ever see.
And welcome to it. Thanks for being with us here on Orioles Magic, the podcast. Brett Hollander and Geoff Arnold. And Geoff, I don't want to take up too much time in our intro to the guest today because our guest is known for being verbose, I'm going to say. And we covered a lot of ground. I want to call it the actually definitive Jim Palmer podcast interview. That is what our special guest, that is who our special guest is today.
I mean, there's so much stuff, you could break it up into two parts, really, if you wanted to. But we covered a ton of ground from the 1983 World Series to best Orioles team to what he learned from his time working with Robin Roberts to his time spent in the booth with Howard Cosell, as well as Earl Weaver at one point. They not only were on the same baseball team, they also were on the same broadcast team. So much fun, and it was one that I really enjoyed.
And also his moment and how much money he got paid for being on the Naked Gun movie, one of my all-time favorite movies. In fact, I recently rewatched it on Netflix. I mean, I probably watch that movie once every few years because it's that funny to me still after all these years. But Palmer does have that appearance with several other famous broadcasters. We talk about Chuck Thompson. We talk about beating Sandy Koufax in the World Series. It's really an enjoyable conversation with Baltimore baseball royalty, number 22, Jim Palmer. And with us today, a very special guest on Orioles Magic, the podcast presented by Miller Lite. It's none other than number 22, Baltimore baseball royalty and the Hall of Famer, Jim Palmer. Jim, thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. Good to be with you.
How are you and your family doing during this time?
Well, we're good. I actually had spinal fusion on my back back in January, so I thought I'd be ready for opening day, except there hasn't been an opening day. I'm certainly going to be ready for opening day if we have one in what I'm hearing, maybe, hopefully, in July. So, fine. My wife's got a home furnishing store that she was planning on closing, so we came down to so anybody wants 50% off of furniture, just call, go online in Island Home, Palm Beach, and there's a lot of really good furniture. So no, we're going to liquidate the store over the next couple of weeks and, just see what's going on with baseball.
Well, Jim, we've been taking this time, going back and talking to some Orioles legends and some great moments and games in Baltimore baseball history. And our highlight today, among the things we'll talk about, is Game 3 of the 1983 World Series, a game where you were the winning pitcher in a World Series game, which wasn't too unusual in your career. You come in, though, out of the bullpen, relieving Mike Flanagan. The Orioles win a tight ball game in front of 65,000 fans at the Vet. What's your recollection of that night in Philadelphia?
Well, it was the first night. We lost, I think 2-1. John Denny Phillies beat us in Game 1. Scotty McGregor pitched back. He pitched great in both the division series and would eventually win Game 5. But every time he would pitch, we wouldn't score a whole lot of runs. And I was sitting in the bullpen the first night, and I'm saying, this is great. We're going to get a World Series here if we win. I think it ended up being somewhere around $65,000. And if we lose, it'll probably be in the $40,000 range. And I said, I'm sitting 380 feet away from home plate. I have to look through plexiglass, and there's a lot of people paying a lot more money sitting behind me. So I was just really happy. If you go back and look at that year, I had a major kind of the quadratus laborum, which is a major stabilizing muscle of your back. I tweaked it in spring training. The doctor said, do what you can do. He didn't tell me it was a major stabilizing muscle of your back. It was before MRIs. So I tried to pitch early on. Scotty McGregor said, it looks like they're stabbing you in the back with a knife. And I said, that's exactly the way it feels. So the whole year, it was a great year. The Orioles, I think, won 98 games. White Sox, actually, who we beat in the division series, won 99. But it was a year where a lot of guys, Mike Boddicker was like 25, 26. I think he won 16 games. Scotty won 18. Flannery was hurt a little bit, was 12. Storm Davis won, I think, 13 games at age 21. So it was a year where I think you saw why the Orioles, from really 65 all the way to 84 when I was with the Orioles, always seemed to have winning teams, is because guys stepped up and did a great job, especially the pitching staff. And then, if you looked at offensively, Cal was the MVP, even though Eddie's numbers were as good or maybe better. John Lowenstein and Gary Renicky, everybody talked about, and I think if you were a Yankee fan growing up like I was, how Casey Stengel used to platoon players. Well, how about, Earl Weaver? You had something, I think, Gary Renicky hit 19 home runs. John Lowenstein hit 15 home runs in left field. That's 34 home runs. They drove in 124 runs between the two of them. That's a pretty good platoon in left field. So we just had a really good ball club. It was a mature ball club. We lost the last day of the season in 1982. You had a new manager, and in the fact that you had Joe Altobelli managing for the first time. So I think a lot of the things that Earl Weaver had done, and then the other thing is, I think almost everybody on the ball club said we're going to show that we can win without Earl Weaver. I didn't have a whole lot to do with it because they only, I think, got 11 or 12 starts, but it was just one of those years where it just seemed like everything came together.
Were you surprised that Earl didn't stay, because it was basically the same team from '82?
No, it's funny. I ended up losing to Don Sutton on the last day of the year. We came from about 8 back in '82, and Earl all year long, Earl had said, "Hey, I'm retiring." So Earl was not into team meetings. I mean, he did not like to have team meetings unless he was really angry. Well, here we are. We win Friday and Saturday. We score like 9, 10, 11 runs in each of the games. It all comes down to Sunday, and right before the game, he calls a meeting, and Richie Dower, our second baseman, says, "No, don't tell us you're not going to retire." And it kind of we ended up losing anyway. But I think a lot of us did think that Earl might change his mind. But as it turned out, I think you got to understand, Earl got 1 3-year contract. I think there was 80, 81, and 82. Every other year from 1968, when he took over at the All-Star break, he was on 1-year deals. Talk about some pressure. Talk about, now we had really good players and won in almost all those years, or at least we're in contention. So I just think Earl had enough. And, when he came back to, I think, managing 85 and 6, somebody said, "Why are you doing that?" He said, "Green fees for the rest of my life." Because I think Earl just wanted to go back down to South Florida and play golf.
Going back to the 83 series, in the synergy in 66 at 20, you beat Sandy Koufax in his last major league start in the World Series. And then obviously Carlton didn't start that game 3 in 83, but he was the losing pitcher. The synergy of that to best 2 Hall of Fame Southpaws, actually, some almost 20 years apart in the World Series. It's pretty interesting looking back at that.
Well, Koufax didn't really pitch poorly. Willie Davis dropped a couple of fly balls, picked up the second one, threw it in the stands. We got some early runs because, it was such an interesting World Series if you go back to 66. We come, we're staying up the Continental Hotel. It was owned by Gene Autry, who owned the Angels. And he was actually there when we got in. I think the first game was on Tuesday, but Sunday night we got in, and Gene Autry is in the lobby, because he was an American League team owner. And I knew him, I knew him and Roy Rogers and all that growing up as a kid. That's what we used to watch on television. So we're going out to to play the Dodgers at Dodger Stadium, and you go down Sunset Boulevard. And back then it was laugh in. Would you believe? And it said, "Would you believe Dodgers 4 straight?" On one of those real estate signs, a set of 3 bedrooms and 2 baths and a pool, it said, "Would you believe Dodgers 4 straight?" Well, Frank and Brooks hit home runs in the first inning. I'm going to pitch the next day. I'm not scared, but I know that I have to pitch well because Koufax is Koufax. He had a 1.95 ERA. He was, pitched 10, 11 shutouts, whatever. A typical year for Sandy in the 60s. So anyway, we hit the home runs. Dave McNally struggles. Mo Grabowski comes in, strikes out 11 in 6 2/3 innings, and kind of set the tone for the rest of the World Series. And when we got back on the bus and went back to the Continental Hotel that same night, would you believe Orioles 4 straight? So for that to happen, Willie Davis had to drop the fly balls. I had to pitch my first shutout in the major leagues. It just happened to be in a World Series. We got 6 runs, mainly because of the errors. I think 4 of them were unearned. And then we won games 3 and 4 back in Baltimore. Wally Bunker, who had been Rookie Pitcher of the Year in 1964, year before I got to the Orioles, then got hurt. He wins 1-0. Paul Blair hits a home run off of Claude Osteen, and then Frank Robinson hits another home run off of Don Drysdale, which is what he and Brooks did in Game 1. And McNally, who had struggled, pitches a 9-inning shutout. I think the Dodgers hit 125 for the World Series. And it kind of, I mean, I was kind of in shock, mainly because, number one, we beat Koufax. Number two, I had never experienced this type of thing. I mean, I grew up in New York, listening and watching, either in between geography and history, listening on my transistor radio what the Yankees were doing, or watching in black and white television. So this was something new, and it was pretty exciting time. And, so starting in '66, I think most of us thought that because Frank Robinson was there, because we had Boog Powell and Blair and Davey Johnson, and had a pretty good ball club, that we would be going to a lot of World Series.
What is the significance of winning World Series games in 3 different decades? What does that mean to you?
Well, I mean, in 1983, I was just happy to win a game because I had to go to the minor leagues. Mike Flanagan, I think he was 12-4 that year. I mean, I was 5-4. They said, listen, if you want to be on the major league roster during the postseason, and they asked Mike and myself, and I said, I'll go. I mean, why? I don't care how many games you won. Why wouldn't you, when you knew? I kind of knew what the picture was. I had helped mentor Flanny and Scotty McGregor and Storm Davis and Mike Barber and all that, and just as Robin Roberts had done it for me. And I knew, Hagerstown's not that far from Baltimore, so why not go up there? John Hart, the irony, John Hart was the manager who would go on to, be the great general manager, I think, of Cleveland and then Texas Rangers and so on down in Atlanta. So I was pretty comfortable. My arm was getting better. I mean, when you hurt your back and I threw 139 pitches in a game after I hadn't pitched for 2.5 months. No going to the minors, none of this stuff. They thought I had torn my rotator cuff. I said, well, let's go to the bullpen, inject my rotator cuff, see if it still hurts. Because I think I had tendonitis. Well, they injected my rotator cuff. It still hurt. I said, I could have been 20 years old and throw 139 pitches after 2 months off, and I think my arm would have been that way. So I needed to, I went up to Boston. I saw Arthur Pappas, who was head of orthopedics at Mass General, also part owner of the Red Sox. And then I just tried to get back to help the ball club. And as it turned out, on my 38th birthday, that was game 3, to have a ball go through Ivan De Jesus's legs. I just happened to be at the right time in the right place. And I hadn't probably pitched in 2 weeks. So it wasn't I wasn't really on my game like I was in 1966.
We had Scotty McGregor on recently, and he said that Jim Palmer was sabermetrics before sabermetrics, that if, we came out of a game or out of an inning and we didn't throw the right pitch in the right count to the right batter, Jim Palmer was there to greet us, to let us know. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, I mean, I don't want to sound like The Last Dance where Jordan was doing what he did. Even though our language is fairly similar at some points, especially if you played for Earl Weaver, not for Joe Alcantara in '83. But no, I mean, that's really what it was about. I mean, we used to pitch pretty much every 4th day. So the days you weren't pitching, you'd sit in the corner of the dugout. You got to understand, the Orioles had 10-man staffs back then. So you had 15 position players. Now you have 12, 13, so you don't have as many. Well, you get in the corner. Terry Crowley, who went on to be one of the great batting coaches and a great, pinch hitter deluxe, went over to Cincinnati after he was with us early and then would come back, won 2 world championships there. Merv Redden, who went on to have a, nice career as a batting instructor. Chico Simone, Kurt Moten, who would lead the International League in batting average. Davey May went on to hit 26 home runs for the Brewers one year. He'd lead them in RBIs. We had a lot of voices in that corner of the dugout, and we would actually watch the game and kind of do what maybe they do with computers now. And I sat in the bullpen when I was 19 years old. My roommate Robin Roberts, who had 270 wins and I didn't have any, he was 38. Sat in the bullpen with Harvey Haddix and Stu Miller, one of the great relief pitchers of all time. Eddie Fisher, Sherm Lawler had been the catcher on one of those, the great White Sox teams in the late 50s. Played the Dodgers in the World Series at the Coliseum in '59, where they used to have like 80,000 people come to see him play. So they called me brash because I asked a lot of questions. I just figured I needed to kind of learn what really the game was played. And, it's interesting when you look at the Orioles from the year I got there, 65 all the way through 84, they had the best winning percentage in baseball. And I think a lot of it had to do with the continuity, the mentoring. I didn't yell at guys. It was corrective, supportive. Hey, this is, and they did it to me because I lost 152 games in the big leagues, so it wasn't like I, was at 400-0. So I think we all kind of, played off each other. And the great thing is whether it was Cuellar or McNally, he might won a Cy Young, should have won another, won 139 games in 7 years for the Orioles. McNally won 20 games 4 times. It was a great comfort to pitch on those staffs because if I didn't win on Monday, I knew one of the other guys, whether it was Scotty or Flanny or Storm Davis or in the 80s, Mike Boddicker, who went on to have a really great postseason that year, won 16 games that year, would pick up the slack.
What were some of the things that you learned, some of the more important things that you learned from somebody like a Robin Roberts and that you then passed on to the Cuellars, the Boddickers, the McGregors?
Well, Robin said the best pitch in baseball. Now, if we get into analytics here in the 2020 season, they probably say this is not the case, but Robin had 270 wins, as I mentioned. He was trying to win 300. He would end up, I think, with 284 or 286. He said the best pitch in baseball is a fastball, and you have a really, really good one. And I hope you're smart enough to know that. He said you got a fastball you can throw for a strike. You got one you can throw for a ball. You got a breaking ball you can throw for a strike. You got a breaking ball you can throw for a ball. He said you got a change up that you use every once in a while just to let them know that you have a third pitch. And that would be about Johnny Carson had just ended. It would be about 1 o'clock, and he would say, "Kid, I'm 38, you're 19." He said, let's talk more about baseball when we have breakfast tomorrow after I get a good night's sleep. So, I learned from Robin. Sammy Ellis was pitching coach for the Orioles, and he said, "Yeah, I live around the corner from Robin down in Tampa, the Tampa Bay area." And I said, "Yeah." He said, one time I asked him, I said, "Who hit the most home runs off you?" I know Nettles hit 9 home runs off me. Jim Rice hit 9 home runs off me. And Robin said to Sammy, he said, some guy hit 19. And Sammy Ellis said, and who won over 20 games one year with Cincinnati, he says, "What do you mean some guy?" He says, "Oh, I forgot his name. They were all solos." So one of the things I learned, you're going to, especially nowadays, who knows what kind of baseball we're going to have in 2020 if we play. Is it going to be the rabbit ball from last year? You pitch in Camden Yards, you're going to throw home runs. The Orioles threw 305, set the all-time record. There were 500 or 600 more home runs than there were the year before. And there were more home runs, more in 2017 and 18, but it's gone up pretty much every year. So one of the things Robin's told me, hey, it's all right to walk guys, but you better know you can get the guy out behind him. And sometimes you have to do that in close games. But I think a rule of thumb, and then as it turned out, one of my godfather of my oldest daughter, Jamie, was Dick Hall, who was a marvelous pitcher for the Orioles. Turkey, he was 6'6", he was a third baseman that the Pirates drafted, and in the Orioles, he turned into a pitcher and became a great reliever for the Orioles over the years. Wonderful man. And I used to run with him because he was a very good athlete. And a lot of the other guys when I got to the Orioles in 1965 ran on their own. You didn't play for Cal Ripken Sr. and run on your own. You ran as a team, and that's what we did when I got to Baltimore. Harry Pekin was there, and then eventually George Bamberger. Cuellar would pitch a one-hitter, and we'd be out in the warning track to run our 18 foul line to foul lines and shag for an hour because we didn't want anybody to be in better shape. And George Bamberger would say, "Where's Mike?" And I said, "Oh, his hips bother him." He said, "Wait a minute, boys." And then he would go into the locker room and get him. And he goes, "Nobody runs till everybody runs." So conditioning, trying to control as many things as you can. And I think, Scotty, I don't know, I'm sure he didn't mention this, but Scotty said, "I learned my lesson when I got traded to the Orioles after the 76 season, and I came to spring training in 1977. You do not come to Miami and be a pitcher on the Oriole team if you don't come to spring training in shape." It is, because I wanted to go to the beach with my kids. I wanted to go play tennis, or I wanted to go play golf. So we got it over with in a hurry. We ran those 18 foul line to foul lines without stopping. So if you want to, and Boddicker was in great shape. Storm Davis, Flanny was a great basketball player. Scotty learned and, became, won 20 games, won 18 games. So I just think, the camaraderie of kind of doing it, I think, and starters are a little bit different. Obviously, nowadays, maybe bullpens play a different role. But I think back then, the starters in the dugout, we stuck up for each other because we knew we were going to pick each others up.
While we're on the subject, for the modern day of pitching, Jim, we obviously know they're not going to make as many starts, and pitching staffs will be more specialized, especially in the bullpen, and what kind of quantify as a good start as far as innings has changed dramatically over the years. But as far as pitching itself, whether it's mechanical or style or what is a necessary thing to do well, how has it changed and evolved over the last 2 decades in your mind, and even going back further to your era of pitching?
Well, I don't think it really has changed that much. I mean, now, of course, you talk about spin rate, with how the ball spins. What kind of spin rate do you have on your fastball? What kind of spin rate do you have on your curveball? I think they look at those numbers. But if you have a bad windup, how do you throw it over? I mean, how do you stay out of the middle of the plate? Obviously last year you could make a good pitch and it could end up being a home run. 77, the ball went 18 feet farther for every 360 feet, but they did a test. They don't do that here in 2019, 2018, 2017. I think they could do a compression test because the ball's going farther. But I don't really think it's changed that much. At the end of the day, I mean, it's nice to know tendencies, and it's nice to know. I mean, we know, the guy is a guy, a high ball hitter, low ball hitter. Does he like the ball on inner half of the plate? What's he do? You visually, you talked about what we did in between games. Well, you're watching video and you're watching players. I mean, I may go in and get something to drink when our guys were hitting, but I always watched the opposition because I knew I had to pitch against them. So I just think now all the information is great, but at the end of the day, if you can't repeat your windup, I mean, you can say, well, I have good spin rate, but I look like there's a guy, Ryan Presley. He was hurt last year, but he went over to the Astros. He threw 95, great curve, really good curveball, except he never threw it over in Minnesota. He goes to Houston. You get Brett Strom, who has been around forever, was a major league pitcher. All of a sudden, still has the same spin rate. He maybe changes his windup a little bit so he can repeat it, and all of a sudden you have somebody. So I think the spin rates, and you look at the numbers, I think now they take pitches away from some of our minor leaguers. And I said, well, why do you do that? And they said, well, because we look at the spin rate, and we look at spin rates of other guys that have similar styles or similar spin rates, and we go, well, this guy's not successful, so maybe one of our Oriole minor league pitchers is not going to be successful. But then again, does he have a deceptive windup? Do you see the ball? There's just so many variables in pitching. I think it's probably easier to quantitate what a guy can do and what he can't do. But at the end of the day, what happens when you go out on the mound? What does your blood pressure go up? How about your heartbeat? You don't know those kind of things. And I think at some point they're going to probably have little things on your wrist that'll tell you that. And you go, oh no, it's blood pressures at 230 or 270. We're out of here. It's time to take it out.
Right.
It's not going to be that kind of thing. So I don't know. I just think they're all great tools, and I like them. But it's kind of like now we got the hitters, they got the K vest, and we got launch angles, and we got all that. But can you look for pitches? I mean, I looked at, let's go to 83. Eddie and Cal. Eddie, it's almost like Eddie Murray knew what was coming. Cal was one of the great guest hitters. Mike Witt, who pitched for the Angels, had a great curveball. Well, Cal would go up there, and that great curveball wasn't that great when he'd look for it. And then it'd be a 3-run home run. Everybody would wonder why. I mean, I watched Eddie Murray when he came up at 77, batting practice down in spring training in Miami, and I go, this kid can't hit. And then the game started. And then I saw, oh, wait a minute. He has an idea of what's coming. Not to mention being a switch hitter, not to mention to be, hand-eye coordination, which is why he had over 500 home runs and 3,000 hits. And there's only 5 guys on that list. And a couple of them you can't even count because they had a little bit of help.
What do you remember about Cal at the very beginning of his career?
Well, he was 4 years old, and we couldn't get him off the field in Aberdeen, South Dakota. I was 18, and he was 4, and he wanted to. We got to Cal, get away. You're going to get hurt out here. No. He started. I don't remember. I've read that he went 4 for 55 or whatever. I don't really remember that. I mean, I know that he came and worked out. I'd read the scouting report. Somebody said, he's going to be the next Jim Palmer. Thank God he was third baseman that turned into a shortstop, so he could go to the Hall of Fame with 428 home runs and over 3,000 hits, and played in 2,630 2 consecutive games. He was just a great athlete. We used to go down. We used to go play basketball and all that. So I had the scouting report. His dad Dad had, Cal Senior was about half Cal Senior or Junior size. He was a very little guy, but talk about tough. But they both loved the games. Everybody used to say that when Cal Senior would go do a clinic or something like that in the off season, Billy would find something else to do, but Cal Junior would always go with his dad because he didn't see him that much. So I mean, I'm a Ripken fan from the day, because I remember the first meeting that, we're in Aberdeen, South Dakota. We're going to live in a basement. We're going to make $414 after taxes, $3 a day meal money, no cell phones, no credit cards. We're going to go on a 9-day trip and they'll give us $27, and we're going to figure out a way to kind of live on that. But we had a meeting where Cal said, listen, he said, and I remember the meeting because I walked everybody. I walked 130 and 129 innings in A-ball. I was 11-3. I struck by guys out because they didn't hit the ball, but I was an equal walker. I would walk anybody in the lineup, pitchers or whatever. He said, and he had a $1 fine for any opposing pitcher you ever walked. Well, it didn't matter if it was a pitcher or the number 4 hitter. I could walk him. I mean, that's just what I did at age 18. So I remember the meeting. He says, we won 14 in a row in spring training. We beat Earl Weaver's AA Elmira team down in Thomasville, Georgia. He says, we're not having that fine. I said, because I didn't make enough money to be paying. That would have been $130 I would have had to pay for walks and all that, whatever. So he said, listen, we're never going to let anybody outwork us. We're going to come to the ballpark and have fun, which means to win. There are no such things as shortcuts. And, so I learned that. And then probably the most important thing when, now we're talking about getting back, and you got the owners saying, we want you to take this share. And the players are saying, well, we're not used to that and blah, blah, blah. He pointed to the empty stands and he said, the only reason we are playing this game is because of the people that come to see us play. So I hope that the owners and the players here in 2020 understand that and think about that.
Jim, we for whatever reason, we've talked a lot about Mike Mussina on this podcast. There's obvious reasons. He's been involved in a lot of big games. We were specifically looking back at one of my favorite nights in Orioles history, and I know you were part of the call of this game, and that's the 28 batter performance against the Indians, arguably in the top 5 best games ever pitched in Orioles history in a regular season. And Mike's certainly in the conversation for second or third best pitcher in club history. We asked Bill Ripken this, and we asked Rick Sutcliffe this. When do they know about a guy like that he could go to be in the Hall of Fame? When you first saw Mike, was he one of those guys you identified as someone that could be that good for that long?
Well, I don't think you ever can anticipate longevity, but I think some of the things you look at, it's funny when I played Babe Ruth ball, I got beat by a guy by the name of Steve Carrier from Northern California, 2-0. I walked 18 on Monday, came back on Wednesday, and got beat by Northern California 2-0. And he and I became best friends. We drove to spring training, and he struck out 20 out of 27 in A-ball and Fox Cities. I went to Aberdeen with Cal Senior. And everybody said they kept me in the big leagues the next year because not that he was as good as I was, they didn't like his windup. Well, you had to like Mike Mussina's windup. He threw the ball downhill as well as anybody. He's very athletic. 3-sport star in high school, I believe. Change up to look like his fastball. So, that makes your fastball even better. He could pitch to both sides of the plate, came up a little cutter, had 2 knuckle curveballs, won 6 or 7 gold gloves. What didn't he do? Well, and now the only problem that he had to deal with was Camden Yards. I don't, you guys, if you know this, but when he was a potential free agent, they actually moved the fences back, 10 or 12 feet? And that didn't work. All they needed to do is give him $88 million and they would have kept him. They didn't have to move the fences back. I know it didn't cost $88 million, but he was a marvelous pitcher and he could hold runners and he was smart. He ended up winning more games than I did. And, maybe didn't pitch as many innings because you weren't required to do that, but he was a marvelous pitcher. I always said that when I did the games. And the other thing is, when you end up in the Hall of Fame, it's not like you didn't have bad games. And he probably made a quick adjustment when he had a bad inning as any guy I ever saw. And, he'd give up, you try and never, I think one of the cardinal rules as a starting pitcher is you don't want to have big innings. You try to stay away from them. How do you do that? You don't walk people. Well, he didn't walk any people. Try to keep the ball in the ballpark. Camden Yards, that's not always possible. Routine fly balls. He hit a 370-foot fly ball with a warning track in left field. It's a home run. Last year you probably hit it about 350 and it sailed out of here because the ball was so live. So, but he dealt with that. He also pitched in the steroid era or the PED, or however you wanted to describe it, and it didn't seem to bother him. And the advantage that he had, as I did, is he pitched for, at least in most cases, good ball clubs, and that certainly helps. And again, I think again, you can't ever anticipate longevity, but he did so many things well. And windups have a lot to do with your health. And, he didn't throw a lot of sliders. He's more of like I said, a little cutter that he came up with. And I just think that helped for his longevity. But he could pitch in any year.
Is there a pitcher or two on the Orioles in the time that you were playing that whenever he was out on the mound, you maybe enjoyed watching this individual or two more than anybody else?
Well, it started with Milt Pappas. I saw Milt Pappas when the Orioles came up to Aberdeen, which was a big deal when they come to play your A team. They thought they were going to have thunderstorms in Aberdeen, South Dakota, and Cal Ripken Sr. went to the tire dealer and got all the retreads. And we didn't have a tarp, but he got canvases and all that just in case it rained. And Milt Pappas started that game, and so did Steve Barber. Steve Barber's first 20-game winner. Milt Pappas didn't want to win 20 because he didn't think that was important. But Milt could pitch. I mean, a lot of people think, hey, Frank Robbins was an old 30. Well, he wasn't. We found that out when he won the Triple Crown, his first year with the Orioles. But the Reds got a real good pitcher. Milt would win over 200 games. He just didn't feel necessary if he had a lead in the 6th or 7th inning to pitch any longer. He was happy being 15, 17, 15 and 8, 16 and 9, and he was able to do that. So in that era, and then, we traded for Mike Cuellar, and Dave McNally in that era. I mean, Mac won 20 games. He was first 20-game winner after Steve Barber. And I laughed because, he won like the last 12 games, I think, in 1968. I was hurt that year. And I think he got a $20,000 raise or $15,000 raise. So he set the tone. If we won 20 games, we could go in and ask for a $15,000 or $20,000 raise. Didn't mean you got it, but we could actually ask for that. So Mac was always one of my favorites. And then, as I mentioned earlier, Mike Cuellar won 139 games in 7 years for the Orioles. He would, Earl Weaver said he didn't like cold weather, and he would yank him early, and Mike would go to one end of the dugout and call him all kinds of names, and Earl was already calling him names before he went out to get him. But then if you needed him to pitch with 2 days rest down the pennant stretch, Mike Cuellar was your guy. So, Cuellar, and then, of course, one of my best friends, and, obviously the tragic suicide was Mike Flanagan. If you look at his first year, I think he was 2 and 8 or 2 and 9. We're going up to Boston, and we used to sit in the bulkhead, and he looked at me and he says, I don't think Earl Weaver has any faith in me. But he was 2 and 8, but he pitched really well, or 2 and 9. I mean, low ERA, just no run support. So I'm going to the bathroom the next night, and the manager's office is right across from the bathroom, and Earl comes in, and he's going to the bathroom, and I said, I can't tell you the language, but I said, Mike Flanagan doesn't think you have any faith in him. And he goes, something faith? I put the guy, another expletive, in the lineup every 4th day, and is 2 and 9. And I said, Earl, I don't care. I said, he doesn't think you have any confidence. I said, call him in, lie to him, do whatever you need to do, because this is you go back to what we used to talk about. I said, if you're going to put him in the lineup every 4 days, fake it. I don't care. If you don't have anybody else, go in there. So he goes to the Boston Globe, and Cliff Keen was a writer, Cliff and Claff, and they loved Weaver because he was always good for a quote. And so he goes, Mike Flanagan is going to be a winning pitcher in the big leagues. He ended up 15 and 10, guys. 2 and 9 to 15 and 10. Do you have any idea? Now, obviously, he pitched just as well, or maybe better. The club played better, which has a lot to do with win and loss records. So Flanny in that era, and then you had other guys. It's funny, Tom Phoebus, who passed away, probably about a year ago or so. I learned a slider. When he came up at the end of 66, he almost pitched 3 shutouts in a row. And I said, what is he doing that I can't do? So I think you always did that. Boddicker came up, Storm Davis was, Mike Flanagan had, Cy Old, that was me, Cy Now, which was him, and then Cy Future, which is Storm Davis, Scotty McGregor, terrific guy, great pitcher. You just go down through the list of all the guys that I really admired. And the other thing is that, Pat Dobson came over. We all won 20 games in 71. Barber was a very unique guy, great sense of humor, very good pitcher. He comes from San Diego. The only thing he did was come to a better ball club. He pitched great. We all won 20 games. And you know what? The irony is we traded Frank to the Dodgers after that year. Dave ends up maybe 13 and 17, Barber 12 and 18, and they pitched better than the year before. We just didn't score any runs. So it's amazing. So a lot of times I think when I do broadcasts, you talk about run support. Year in and year out, you want to be consistent. But at the end of the day, some years, maybe your record's a little bit better than it was supposed to be. Or maybe not as good as it should have been.
Yeah, certainly, those names, I mean, clearly for about 20 years, maybe 25 years, the best pitching franchise in baseball.
Well, it's funny. We're talking about 83. If you go back, we lose, 2-1 in the first game. Lamar Hoyt beats us in the division series. He won the Cy Young Award. John Denny won the Cy Young Award in the World Series for the Phillies. We lose that game 2-1. I think the White Sox only scored 3 runs in the 4 games. And then when we beat the Phillies, I think it was 19-3. The Orioles outscored Chicago. And then when you go to the World Series, I think we outscored the Phillies maybe 19-8, something like that. So pitching even in that, even all the way from 66 when the last 3 games were shutouts. My first shutout ever, and then Bunker and Dave McNally in Game 4, and then you go all the way to through 1984, or at least through 83 when we win the last championship. The Orioles have won. Pitching was a big part of it.
I asked Eddie this, and he said 83. But for all the time that you spent playing for the Orioles, what team do you think was the best team?
Ooh. Well, we didn't. The 69 team was pretty good. We won 109 games. The next year we won 108. We win that World Series game, and then in 71 we have the 420 game winners. It's funny when you go back and if you look at the 83 team and you look at, again, Earl Weaver had left, but a lot of, the Renicky, Lowenstein, platoon, Earl had formulated that. Earl was the guy that made Don Buford the best leadoff guy in the American League, not as a second baseman, which is what we traded for, but a left fielder. So if you look at the 83 team, it was pretty good. I would like to think that I would have been on one of the teams because I didn't do anything in 83 other than that. But, it was a real good ball club. You got Cal and you got Eddie, you got Kenny Singleton. We didn't even mention Singy. You look at him, and on base percentage was close to 400. You get the platoon, as I mentioned, you get 34 home runs and 124 RBIs out of your left fielders. You had Al Bumbry, who was a marvelous player. And, I tweeted, I think Al turned, 64 a couple weeks ago or whatever. Maybe I might be 62 or 3 or 4. It doesn't really matter. But I'm a tough grader because I saw him come up at AA, he had 335 or 6, AAA 335 or 6, and then 337 his first year in the big league. So when they talk about they're all young guys, what did you do in AA? Because I saw guys like Bumbry and do that. But if you look at that ball club, Tito Landrum comes over. He only had 100 at bats. He hits the big home run in the division series. One of the great stories about the 83, and I don't know if you've talked to Rick Dempsey or he talked to you because Demper is Demper. But probably in maybe late August, early September, we're on the bench and Demper is talking to Mike Flanagan. He says, Flanny, he says, this is not fair. And Mike says, what do you mean it's not fair? He said, I've never been hot for a day. I've never been hot for a week. I've never been hot for 2 weeks. I've never even had a good month. And guess who's the MVP in the World Series? Whether he deserved it or not, he was able to get it. No, I always give Denver a hard time. But he had 4 doubles. He only had 16 in the year. He had 4 more in the World Series. And a home run. And, Eddie hit the big 3 home run in Game 5. It was just a real good team. If you go back to one of the great games, and I know a lot of people, and again, I don't know if you guys have had a chance to talk to Tippy, but the game where he ends up picking off the 3 guys in the 10th inning against Toronto, I don't know if you know how that started. That was the first inning that Lenny Secada ever caught. And the first pitch, Cliff Johnson off of Tim Stoddard. Now, you got to understand, Stoddard's 6'7", 6'8". Lenny's probably 5'7". It looks like Lenny's giving a sign. It looks like he's standing up behind home plate. And the first pitch that Stoddard throws, Cliff Johnson hits over the bullpen. So I think it was 4-4. Now it's 5-4. So they bring in Tippy. Dave Collins, I think, got on. You know, he used to steal 50 to 60 bases a year. He wants to steal because he could. And Tippy just throws over there and picks him off. Tippy did not have a good pickoff. That inning he did because they were so anxious to run against the Cicada. And then Lenny comes up and ends up hitting a game-winning home run in the bottom of the 10th inning. And that's kind of what the 83 team was all about. And so, you know, arguably there were a lot of good ball clubs. You know, I mean, it's hard not to say that the 97 Orioles may have been as good a team as anybody. They just, you know, Armando Benitez disease, you know, where he threw the 3-run home run to Marquise Grissom. I was sitting behind the dugout in the second row. I wanted to charge the mound because I couldn't believe that he threw that pitch, a hanging slider. He's throwing 100 miles per hour. But, you know, so a lot of good ball clubs. And it's the Oriole fans have had a lot of special teams to be able to watch over the years. And they've been very supportive.
And 98 wins in 97, wire-to-wire season, and really good pitching, great bullpen, maybe one of the best bullpens of all time. Jim, I do want to ask you about your transition into broadcasting. When did you know? I mean, everyone always knows you as a guy who is, you know, knows the game in and out, but when did you know you wanted to make that leap when you were finally done playing into broadcasting?
Well, actually, in 1978, Matt Marola was Reggie Jackson's agent. And he called me. He said, listen, the Yankees and the Red Sox are going to have a one-game playoff. ABC called me, and they said, would you be interested in broadcasting if the Yankees win? So I actually watched that playoff game. We were building a house, and I had rented Tommy Chopet's house. Looked like a kind of like an antique store because we had all our furniture in this little house in Timonium. And I gave him money to go buy a house in Florida so we could actually live there. And I had my suitcase on the bed, and I don't know if you remember that game, but the Red Sox had an early 2-0 lead. And Mike Torres, who actually is one of our teammates, won 20 games for us and then was part of the Reggie Jackson, Kenny Holtzman trade, went out to Oakland, and eventually he's pitching for the Red Sox. And Bucky Dent comes on, and he throws him a fastball, and he hits a 3-run home run. So now all of a sudden I got that suitcase out. I start packing a little bit because I'm only going to Kansas City to do the playoffs with, as it turned out, the Yankees and Kansas City if the Yankees win. So, it's 3-2, 4-2, 5-2, and then it's 5-3, 5-4, and then Gossage comes in and gets the Red Sox out in the 9th inning. I think he got Yaz and Jim Rice, 2 Hall of Famers. Maybe, I don't think he got Fisk out, but he got him out. Yankees win, and I go to work with Howard Cosell and Keith Jackson in Kansas City. And I actually borrowed Howard Cosell's jacket. Humble Howard kind of leaned over, but he wore like a 43 or a 44 long. And, we had those gold ABC jackets. So I had an extra one. He had an extra one because Howard always traveled with 2 coats. So anyway, I go there, and that's kind of when I first, did the game. And, Keith Jackson said, "Well, you'll know by the 3rd inning whether you have it or you don't." So I'm doing the 3rd inning. Going, do I have it or do I don't? And Howard would actually make me come up and watch the National League playoffs, and he would add, "Young man, they're talking too much. This is regurgitation." And, he would go through his Howard Cosell stuff and all that. And so that's how I got into broadcasting. So so the years we weren't in the playoffs or the World Series, so 79, we lost to the Pirates, but went to the World Series, in 7 games, great World Series, even though it ended poorly. In fact, we never ended well against the Pirates because they were 2 7-game World Series, but really well played. Didn't do the game. I did the playoffs in 80. No broadcasting in 79. 81, I did the World Series with Keith and Howard, and then Al Michaels out in California. In fact, I did the Fernando Valenzuela game, and he was the talk of the baseball world. I mean, marvelous pitcher out of Mexico. If he pitches a shutout in Game 3 of the 81 World Series against the Yankees, he would have been the youngest guy to ever pitch a shutout in the World Series. So I was silently, I had my pom-poms when he gave up. So anyway, 81, 82, we lost on the last day of the year. I went out and did the playoffs with Keith Jackson and Earl, because Earl had retired. So, and Earl, there's no 7-second delay in broadcasting. So, and then Earl would, it's funny, he couldn't reach the telestrator because his arms weren't long enough. They had to put risers. So it was, I mean, I'm not making fun of him, but that's the truth. And he would always, Dennis Lewin was the producer, and he would say, Earl, should you bunt? Earl would go, I wouldn't bunt. He didn't realize you had to do the talk back on your box. You know, so I was, so I did that in, in 82. We're in the World Series in 83. And then Tigers started out 35-5. And in 1984, the pennant race was over after the first 40 games. And, I actually had a good spring. Nobody pitched well in the month of April. And they asked me because I'd hurt my knee in the World Series, do you want to go on the disabled list or do you want to go be a broadcaster? So I went and became a broadcaster. So that's really how it started, just doing the playoffs in 1978, hoping that the Yankees would win. Otherwise, I would have watched it, played golf, go crabbing with Frank Cashin. The only time I ever went crabbing was the day that Bucky Dent hits the home run. I was out on Middle River at about 7 o'clock in the morning. I don't even eat crabs. And I came home, watched the game, and ended up getting into broadcasting.
Speaking of broadcasting, how did the Naked Gun gig come along?
They called. They said, "You want to be in a movie?" They're having a broadcasting scene. It's a very important game. Queen Elizabeth's going to be there. You're going to be with 5 other broadcasters. You're going to have your own psychologist, which I sometimes wish that, especially the last 2 seasons we had in Baltimore, Joyce Brothers had been up there, when things aren't going as well as it did. No, they said, listen, come out to the coast, $7,500 to do the movie, first class ticket. I have a friend, Teddy Grossman, who's now 89, but his brother lives on the beach in Santa Monica. I love to play volleyball. We'll go biking. We'll go to the movies. We'll go to dinner. You can do the movie. So we got to the studios about 8 o'clock in the morning. They'd still be shooting if Tim McCarver, who's in the broadcasting scene, didn't have to go do the Dodgers and the Mets. He was broadcasting for the Mets. So he got out of there about 4 o'clock because it was one more take. And of course, you think about, Kurt Gowdy was there. I'm hugging Kurt Gowdy, who, his son would be our executive producer, not only at Wide World of Sports, but also baseball. Kurt was one of the Hall of Fame broadcasters. Dick Vitale, who whispers at lunch, by the way. He only yells on the air. I couldn't hear him. I mean, and my hearing, this is not now when I can't hear. So my wife says, you had Mel Allen, who I listened to when I was a kid, did the Yankee games. I mean, you had a cast of characters. And like I said, it was a big game. And, the movie, I love it. People go, yeah, I loved your movie. I go, yeah, it's mine. Yeah, right. So that's how it started. It's not like George Lopez, where apparently I'm a bobblehead. I've never seen that. But people say, yeah, I saw in George Lopez where, he wants his son Max, I think, to play baseball. So he goes into his office and he's got a Steve Garvey, a Rod Carew, and a Jim Palmer bobblehead. And he gets inspiration to talk to his son by talking to us. And we, of course, answer bobbling our heads and all that,
On a much more hyper-local level, even though he did do many national broadcasts, when it comes to broadcasting, your relationship with Chuck Thompson. I mean, I've heard over the years you talk about Chuck, of course, going back to, me growing up and listening to Chuck Thompson's greatest hits and things like that. But just what did Chuck mean to the Orioles?
Well, I think, if you're a Baltimore sports fan, he did the Colts. And when I got to Baltimore, the Colts were one of the greatest teams in the NFL, with the Unitas. And after we won the World Series, we came back and they were working out at Memorial Stadium. And I'm watching the Unitas throw these 15-yard, outs to Raymond Berry. And I'm going, it's like 95 miles per hour on the corner. He hadn't made his cut and the ball's on its way. And then I'd go to the games. What do you do on Sunday? They sold out. I went to the championship game in 1966. Joe Rash Field, downtown Baltimore, a friend of mine was good friends with me. And Barry Robinson, as a lawyer, said, hey, you want to go to the championship game? But you're going to have to pay the $5.50. I said, $5.50? Underneath the overhang if it snows or it rains, you won't get wet. I said, sure, I want to go. And then the Colts end up losing, but it was a great game. The Packers got an early lead, and Unitas took them down 10-7. And then Willie Davis, who just passed away, the Hall of Fame defensive, he blindsided him and he fumbled, and people are booing Johnny Unitas. And I'm going, it's Johnny Unitas. You don't boo. We're not going to get our tickets. They were $5.50. You only 8 games. I go, I'll take them. I raised my hand. Because, when you lived in Baltimore, but, Chuck did those games and did our games. Chuck was very fair. he was, had the fabulous voice. When I was hurt, when I was hurt a couple of, 67 and 68, I was on the disabled list, the year and a half I really missed. So I got to listen to Chuck more than I really wanted to, but I don't mean that derogatorily, but we used to play golf. We used to, he was one of the guys. We used to go down to Hilton Head after the season was over. We'd have 8 guys and we'd rent condos and we'd play golf every day and all of that. We got to Pine Ridge, used to have an eightsome, and Chuck lived very close to Pine Ridge up on Delaney Valley Road. So he was a great guy. It's funny. I was listening to a game once and Danny Ford playing right field, who actually was on the 83 team, and Chuck never criticized people. I mean, Reggie went around from first to third one day, or he was maybe going to third, came around second base and did one of those half slides and then went back to second. And Chuck on the radio says, "There's not enough mustard to cover this young man." I mean, that was about as critique, as negative as Chuck Thompson was going to be. But Danny Ford loses a ball on a Sunday afternoon in right field, and the ball drops, and bright day. It was, sometimes that happens to outfielders. And Chuck goes, "For those of you, Danny Ford just, I can't even do his voice. It's so deep. Just dropped the ball in right field, for a 2-base error. And you're probably wondering what Danny Ford and Michael Jackson have in common." And I think Bill O'Donnell was doing the games where he said, what is that, Chuck? He said, "They both wear a glove on their left hand and nobody knows why." Oh, God, I don't know. Well, that was it. That was Chuck. That was Chuck at his worst, being critical. I think he'd probably just seen enough. So, no, Chuck was the greatest. And, it's funny, but he was a very private guy. I had a late friend who was a real estate guy, Hank Linz, who was good friends with Chuck. And when Chuck's wife, Rose, and you had to understand, when when we were in all those World Series and playoffs, we'd have team parties, and all the broadcasters and their wives would come and whatever. And when Rose passed away, I wrote him a nice note, and I'm riding in the car with Hank Linz down in spring training, and I said, "Chuck's really a private guy." And he says, "Yeah, but he said, he has a kind of a shell." And I said, I didn't expect him to respond, but when I wrote him a note about Rose passing away, I said he never really mentioned that, or he never even acknowledged it. He said he keeps it in his glove compartment. And but this was Chuck. So, maybe as good as he was, he had that facade that he didn't get overly emotional. I mean, he was such a professional. And if now they're playing all the old time of games. If you listen to a radio broadcast of the 90s or the 66 World Series, it was Chuck and Vince Scully, because the local radio, television guys or radio guys did it. Now, of course, it's nationally broadcast and so on and so on. But so, Chuck was one of us. And, I was so happy that he got in the Broadcasting Hall of Fame. And because, this is why, when we get back to playing, we got to make sure that it happens. Not because of money, because fans live for the voices of you guys and the Chuck Thompsons of the world. I mean, that's, I told Vince Scully once, I said, I used to put me to sleep. I said, "Don't take this bad." I said, "But when I was a kid, I used to always listen to Dodger radio. And, sometimes I, did my homework and all that. And you had such a melodious voice, Dodger baseball." And he started laughing. He goes, "You're not the first person that told me that I put him to sleep." But it's funny. You used to go to Dodger Stadium, and I'm sure they, the same thing in Baltimore. People would actually have their transistor radio on with not a headset, but earphones to listen to Chuck Thompson. He was that good, and as is Vince Scully and all the great broadcasting.
I guess the last one for me is, how is your memory as good as it is? Because you can go back and relay sequences and different games and things like that I think most people have long forgotten. Like, how's your recall as good as it is?
Well, sometimes, I don't remember. I remember most things, but there are really good, like, I didn't realize this till somebody had tweeted it or something about, like opening days. I just saw it the other day, 5-1 with a 140 ERA. Now, I would never know that. Now, I knew I pretty much pitched well on opening day, mainly because if you won 20 games, and I played on all those great teams, you won 20 games 8 out of 9 years. Every year that you started the next year, they took the 20 games away. You're starting from scratch. It's, you're a chef. Hey, everything great on Friday night, or you own a restaurant, everybody comes, everybody's happy, food was great, chef had a good night, you know, and then on Saturday, the food critic comes and things aren't going. You know, chef had an argument with his wife, the waiter, you know, was late, blah, 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 blah. So I've kind of learned all that stuff. But I mean, I remember a 1-0 win in Milwaukee on opening day because it snowed and the game was half an hour late because they had to get the snow off the bleachers in center field because of the glare. And, you know, and they got a leadoff guy in a 1-0 lead in the 9th inning on the road. And the guy tries to bunt, Charlie Moore, and Dempsey doubles him up to second base. And next guy flies out and you win 1-0 on the road. You're going, how'd that happen against the Brewers? I mean, I'm talking Yount, Molitor, and Gorman Thomas and those guys. I won a game against Ferguson Jenkins, who's another Hall of Famer, 1-0 in Baltimore when he pitched for the Red Sox. I don't remember one thing about that game. Now, I can remember when Fergie beat me in Texas 2-1, you know, and every time he needed an out, Demper would come up and you throw him that slider and he'd swing with one hand. But, you know, it's just, I don't know. You know, you just remember certain things. You don't remember everything. And, you know, the problem that I've found is now that they have retro sheet, you can't really lie as much. They go back and look at every box score and every game, and, you know, that you can. So at the end of the day, I mean, I remember a lot of things, but I mean, I'll be honest, you know, when Bill Stetka called me, who's calling right now because he didn't answer his phone earlier, said, we're going to talk about 83. I said, I probably need to go back and revisit that. You know, but, you know, the other thing is you guys will, you know this, or you'll find this. When you broadcast, you better be prepared. Mm-hmm. I mean, you know, Greg Maddux walked up to me and he says, you know, I want to be like you and Don Sutton. I said, oh, what is that? He goes, I want to play golf all day long, and I just want to come to the ballpark and, you know, broadcast a 3-hour game. I said, Craig, I said, what do you make, $16, $17 million? I said, I want to be like you. You know? So people, I think, don't realize, you know, whether, you know, I mean, I'm very fortunate to work for Masson. You know, Don D'Agostino is as good a producer as anybody I've ever seen. Tim Walbert left, so you know we're going to have a new director, but we have great people, from cameramen to the people that do all our stuff, and you know, all the off the field personnel. So, and I learned that at ABC when I worked all those years at ABC, where you had your researchers. You know, Steve Hurt used to write the Elias with his brother and all that. He used to do notes. So we used to call it the script, because that's what Howard Cosell would read pretty much when he would do the games. You know, he didn't have any unique thoughts. You know, this is a game, no. So anyway, the end of the day, you know, broadcasting is about being prepared, and I don't think it's any different than playing. I mean, in a sense, I mean, more people. I mean, you know, I was reading, you know, the worst things that ever happened in the broadcasting booth, you know, or whatever that people were talking about. I wasn't on the list, even though I'm sure I have my moments. You know, when you forget that it's, you know, you think the inning's over, or you forget how many outs there are, or whatever. But, or, you know, you have that mind blank where you're working with Gary Thorne, or you go, you know, what's his name? You remember back then? And, you know, so, yeah, it's broadcasting. I mean, it's a great gig, but I never really thought to kind of do a 360. Never thought that when I did that playoff game, and when I was in 1978, when I was 33, that I'd still be broadcasting when I'm, you know, 74 years old. But I think my mind and the fact that you're willing to do the work has a lot to do with that.
Yeah, it's only 35 years later, so you made a pretty good career out of it, Jim.
Well, you know, it's funny. I used to, when I did the playoffs in 1988, I'd go down and play volleyball early in the morning. I'd stay with my friend, the stuntman, and then, you know, games were 5:05 or 5:08 out there. And so I could go biking and playing volleyball in the morning and do a little bit of work, and they pick me up at 12 o'clock, go to the ballpark, and, you know, you do the game and whatever. And so the Mets and the Dodgers, I do the game with Al Michaels and Tim McCarver, and Lenny, they call him a leatherback because he'd been there for 50 years. His back was like leather because he'd been in the sun so much. He goes, he said, you know, I thought you and Al Michaels and McCarver were off last night. Dodgers lose 3-2. And I said, really? I said, God, I thought we did a nice job. I said, I thought we covered everything. It was a good game. And he goes, no, there's something off, something going. So Dodgers win 9-4 the next night. I come down to play volleyball. He says, God, you guys were great. And I realized it was because his team won. You know? So let's hope that the Orioles No, it's that the Orioles are taking this time to regroup, and they're going to have a much better 2020 when we get to play. I mean, it's funny. It's been a couple of tough years, and you go through those things. But I kind of, once I got through the back surgery, I was really looking forward to the season because, you're going to see a lot of new faces. It's funny. You get to the Hall of Fame. I started in 19. Nobody knew I was going to be any good. You don't know what Austin Hayes is going to do. John Means has a great rookie year. Now what does he have to do? He's got to figure it out again. I mean, he certainly looks like he's certainly capable of doing that. So it's going to be a little more difficult, I guess, because it's not like you're coming out of spring training. It's in a very tough division. The Yankees are certainly, they kind of, beefed up their team and whatever. They'll probably actually get healthier because of this. Paxton was going to be out and Severino's gone for the year. But it's going to be a nice season again, and we just don't know what it's going to look like.
Well, Jim, I know Geoff feels this way. We can't wait to see you hopefully soon and work with you hopefully very soon. So that was so much fun doing this. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, you're welcome. I'll be the guy with the mask.
Easily identifiable then.
Yeah, well, yeah. I don't have any underlying conditions now that I got rid of the shingles that I had last summer, but just the age factor. But I just hope that they, I hope they get a settlement, but I just really hope that they get a little more of a handle on this COVID-19 because there's, it obviously affects baseball, but we know how much the meaning it has for everybody all across this country and really the world. So let's hope that they get that straightened out a little bit as well as they can. But anyway, great being with you guys. I'm looking forward to maybe a little in July.
In July. Sounds good to us. Jim Palmer, the Hall of Famer. Thank you for joining us.
You're welcome.
Learning is important year-round, and that is why we're excited to offer our fans the Summer Slugger program. Summer Slugger is a fun, interactive, online course that uses the game of baseball to help kids ages 8 to 11 maintain their math and literacy skills during the summer months. Summer Slugger is a continuous and engaging learning experience that uses the game of baseball to prepare students of all backgrounds to enter the next school year on track. To learn more and register with code Orioles, visit summerslugger.com/Orioles.
And Geoff, great stuff with Palmer covering all that ground. I love the question about how he recalls everything, it seems. And I don't think he gave us a full answer on that, but it is weird. But to a younger generation who probably only know the main color commentator on Orioles broadcasts after all these many decades, I think it's important to kind of put this into perspective. Palmer comes up in 1965 at the age of 19. He goes 5-4 with a 3.72 ERA. Gets in 27 games that year. The next year, he beats Sandy Koufax in the World Series at the age of 20, and he goes 15-10 with a sub 3.5 ERA. His last major league game came in 1984 at the age of 38, in between 3 Cy Young awards, a couple of second-place finishes in the Cy Young race, also 7 20-win seasons, 268 and 152 with a 2.86 ERA, spanning from the middle 60s to the middle 80s. And you mentioned it, he was a winning pitcher in 3 separate World Series, in 3 separate decades, Geoff, in 3 separate decades. And I believe he's the only Oriole to play for all 3 World Championship clubs, and he played for all the pennant-winning clubs as well. So that's, a lot of guys were obviously big parts of multiple Orioles pennant-winning teams. Okay, we know Brooks and Frank and Boog and guys like that, Eddie, Cal. But the reality is Palmer's the only one who's the common denominator in all the pennant-winning clubs and all the World Championship clubs. And to me, that's something.
Here's the other thing you have to consider. I mean, Jim Palmer will always say that he played on a lot of really good teams. And he talked about, the Orioles from when he got there to when he finished up. You're talking about the best team in baseball if you look at it over that entire stretch. But how good would some of those Orioles pitching staffs have been if they didn't have Jim Palmer there? I mean, Scotty McGregor went and talked about it in the podcast that we had with him, that we may not have had sabermetrics, but we did have Palmer. And
that's a great point.
He came from a different era where pitchers were there watching the games. They broke things down in a different fashion because they didn't have all the gadgets that you have today. So Palmer's influence is not only what he accomplished individually, which puts him as the best pitcher in Orioles history and a Hall of Famer. No one doubts that. But I wonder just how good would some of those Orioles teams have been, how some of those pitchers would have pitched if Palmer had not been there with them, guiding them, giving them lessons, and helping them develop and improve. And you hear stories about that all the time. And, especially, the one that he told about Mike Flanagan as well. I mean, that was, an example of just how you talk to Earl Weaver, you try and get Flanagan to believe in himself, and he goes something like 13-1 the rest of the season. I mean, Palmer's impact was far from just the way that he pitched individually.
Yeah, there's no question about it. And just an anchor, an ace for the staff for really a couple of decades. And it is a Hall of Fame career. I think, and I grew up listening to him obviously on television and watching him, and certainly has impacted my baseball mind many times over in that way. I think, Geoff, as we analyze people as broadcasters, it's just hard to find people who come across that knowledgeable and that honest. And, he mentioned Chuck wouldn't criticize. I think you would agree with me. It's hard as a non-player. It's hard as a former player to criticize. That is almost, it just doesn't happen today. And Palmer's known as someone who's just going to call it as he sees it. And I think it's refreshing. Easier said than done. I've known players who have not liked some of the things they've heard. They're not obviously watching it live. But to me, that's sort of, I'm going to say what I see is refreshing, and it's unique in many ways nowadays. And, I've really enjoyed watching that part of his life and career on television.
And that's the thing about Jim Palmer, is that when he criticizes or he says something that maybe a player doesn't like, think about who it's coming from. This is coming from the best pitcher in Orioles history. This is coming from somebody who, and I know that there is a tendency when you look at the Ford Frick winners to pick play-by-play broadcasters, right, but somebody that's had a career not only as a Hall of Fame pitcher, but as a Hall of Fame broadcaster really as well. He can kind of say what he wants to say because he's not only had a great deal of success, he not only is a key part of Orioles history in multiple facets, but he's somebody that has seen the game evolve over the course of multiple decades and has adapted and has grown and as both a player and as a broadcaster over that stretch. So he offers a certain degree of authority that I think very few play-by-play broadcasters or analysts or just anybody can claim.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. It was a really fun conversation. And I'm going to call it the definitive Jim Palmer podcast interview. I think it was on Buster Oldies recently and some others. Well, I'll say this is the definitive Jim Palmer podcast interview. Hopefully it lives for all time, wherever fine podcasts are downloaded or watched also in our case. Geoff, a lot of fun. We have some great guests coming up next week. We're not ready to announce them yet, but obviously keep checking us out at Orioles.com/podcast, wherever podcasts are downloaded. We have some Cool on Deck shows coming up if you're not checking those out. Thursday at 4:15, Sundays at noon for some of the best Orioles games ever to rewatch and relive. And I come on with the pregame show for all of those. So catch up on those. And then they're out there on social media all day if you can't catch them live. So the On Deck show, we're having a lot of fun putting that together. So a lot of great content is out there.
There's no question about it, and you've been doing a great job with the On Deck show. I watch all the time as I also watch some of these Orioles games back on different social media platforms. And, it's not only just us, but Melanie Newman with The Grind talking to current Orioles players. We're trying to find different ways to keep everybody engaged and ready for Orioles baseball whenever it will return. And that includes some Orioles trivia as well, presented by our friends at Pepsi Zero Sugar, which Melanie hosts on Tuesdays. I'm getting to do my first one coming up, and I'm super excited because maybe if I could be a baseball broadcaster, then I would have liked to have been Alex Trebek or Pat Sajak. So this is giving me a chance to do that.
You have Pat Sajak written all over you, Geoff. So big Orioles fan, by the way. Pat, if you're watching or listening, we love you. We can't wait to see you at the ballpark. All right, Geoff, we'll be back in a couple of days with some more Orioles Magic, the podcast. Be well, be safe, everyone. Thanks for being with us.